Hey, welcome everyone. I think we'll make a start. Thanks for attending this webinar. My name is Tristan Claridge, and I'm the convener of the webinar series for the International Social Capital Association. The association's mission is to advance the research and application of the social capital concept, and the association is welcoming new members. In this webinar, I'll be giving a presentation about the strengths and weaknesses of social capital in Guernsey. I've been working on social capital now for over 20 years, and I'm very passionate about the theory and conceptualization of social capital and how we can both improve our research and our application of the concept in the real world. So in this session, I'll be talking about a project that I did recently in Guernsey. The aim was to safeguard the social capital and to improve economic development and social well-being. The project was commissioned by the Institute of Directors in Guernsey in the UK, and they really had a lot of vision in instigating this project, which was really important and I think very illuminating of the situation in Guernsey. Overall, we took a participatory community approach to this project and the way in which we applied and evaluated social capital in Guernsey. And it was really across multiple stages. I'll be talking about the first stage in this webinar, which is this research project that evaluated the strengths and weaknesses of social capital in Guernsey. And then stage 2 was a convention hosted by the Institute of Directors in Guernsey, which was the start of opening that discourse about the nature of the results and the implications of the research. And then stage 3 would be for the community itself to be able to identify the kinds of actions they might like to implement to help to safeguard social capital in Guernsey. And then stage 4, somewhere down the line, perhaps in 2 or 3 years, we're looking at a re-evaluation of social capital and evaluation of the impact of the stage 3 initiatives. So I'll give you a bit of background about Guernsey. You may not have heard of the country before. It's a small self-governing British Crown dependency. It's located in the Channel Islands. So that's the Channel Islands between the UK and France. And Guernsey is one of those Channel Islands. So it has a population of about 64,000 people, and its parliament and government is called the States of Guernsey, which is pretty much or very nearly autonomous and have control over internal affairs and certainly external affairs to a certain extent. However, in theory at least, the Crown retains certain powers to intervene, although that doesn't tend to happen. And overall, the economy is characterized by a high level of sophistication in financial services. So a little bit more about Guernsey. One of the things about this presentation you might enjoy is I've included a lot of photos of Guernsey. So by the end of this, you might feel like you've actually visited Guernsey. So certainly there's a long history of human occupation in Guernsey dating back to around 5000 BC. This photo here actually is of a burial site that is about 4000 years old. So it's had a rich history through the Middle Ages. At times it was a haven for pirates. And of course, as I'm sure many people are aware, during World War II, it was actually occupied by Nazi Germany. And when it was liberated in 9th of May 1945, that's celebrated as Liberation Day in Guernsey. And it's a very important event each year. And Guernsey has a strong cultural identity and a history of reinvention over the years. Horticulture used to be one of its primary industries, but that died out some time ago, and now it's more like financial services. So I'm not going to talk a great deal about what social capital is, but I should at least touch on it, since that's the focus of this research project. So in a general sense, social capital is the ability, capacity or potential for people to be able to cooperate and work together and interact and exchange positively. And it's a form of capital because we can invest in positive and productive working relationships, and we can create effective groups and organizations and establish constructive and inclusive institutions. So social capital really at its heart relates to environments where people are inclined to cooperate, collaborate, and participate in collective action, which represents a vital stock of future benefit. So what we did here is we evaluated social capital in Guernsey, and that was we looked at the strengths and weaknesses of social capital in Guernsey. And really, an evaluation of social capital could take many different forms. You could look at the size or configuration of works. You could evaluate levels of trust or the nature of social norms. Perhaps you could look at the extent of social infrastructure, the types of community spaces that might be available for people to be able to interact and exchange, or perhaps rates of associational membership. And there's many, many different ways you might go about evaluating social capital. But when you think about what social capital is and what a good evaluation or a thorough evaluation might be, we need to take into account the fact that social capital is multidimensional. Now, just about everybody agrees that that is the case. And so we need to evaluate the various dimensions or aspects. It can't be, if we want to do a thorough evaluation, it can't be unidimensional. We need to look at the various different aspects. Another quality of social capital is that it's not one thing that does one thing. The nature of social capital that results in innovation might be very different than the nature of social capital that results in other kinds of outcomes. So therefore, we need to evaluate the complex nature of components such as trust and norms and identity to evaluate how they produce different kinds of outcomes. We also know that social capital can have both positive and negative qualities and can produce various outcomes, often simultaneously. And therefore, it's important to evaluate not only the strengths of social capital, but the weaknesses as well. And we also know that social capital, not everybody has the same ability and opportunity to be able to build and use social capital for personal and collective outcomes. Therefore, we also need to evaluate how people with different earned and inherited characteristics can build and use social capital differently. And we also know that activation contexts of social capital can powerfully influence outcomes. So we need to evaluate the nature of the activation context and its influence on outcomes. So with this in mind, we can see that a simple measure of social capital isn't going to give us a rich picture of what's going on. Instead, what we did for this project, and I think it's a very useful methodology for evaluating social capital, is we followed a format similar to a SWOT analysis in strategic planning. Because what this does is it allows us to develop a detailed picture of the nature of social capital and its influence on economic development and social well-being. And a SWOT analysis, if you've done a bit of strategic planning, looks at not just the strengths, but also the weaknesses, as well as the opportunities and the threats as well. So to base our evaluation of social capital in Guernsey, we used our logic schema of social capital. Because what this does is it allows us to consider the enabling environment, the source of social capital, if you like, that then creates the actual social capital itself. It allows us to consider the individual and collective properties across the two core aspects of connectedness and predispositions that then facilitates the kinds of outcomes that we might be interested in. In this case, we're particularly interested in economic development and social well-being. So we can understand the nature of the activation context that then brings about those kinds of outcomes. So this further details is a list of the kinds of components or aspects that are involved in each of those different aspects. And this really provided the interview guide that we used for the research so that we could prompt people and ask questions about each of these different aspects of social capital, as well as the nature of the enabling environment and the activation context. So what was the research? What we did is we employed an exploratory mixed method approach using a sequential design. So this means that the initial qualitative findings were used to inform the design of a subsequent survey study that could confirm the extent to which those initial findings were reflected in the wider community. And the benefit of this kind of a methodology is that it combines theory generation that is really strong in qualitative research with confirmatory testing of quantitative research to ultimately produce a more robust understanding of the research context. So as I said, it was conducted over two parts. Firstly, qualitative, followed by quantitative. So in that first part, we conducted in-depth focus groups and one-on-one discussions. There was 27 people involved, and we made sure that they had a good understanding of the nature of Guernsey and what it was like to live in Guernsey and social capital in Guernsey. So we made sure they'd lived in Guernsey for at least 5 years. We also made sure we had a wide range of ages and genders and positions within society. And these photos you're seeing on the slides, these are actually photos of Guernsey. And as I mentioned, there's quite a few of them, and you might enjoy some of the picturesque scenery as we go through the presentation. So from all of that data, there was over 20, each interview or focus group was over an hour long typically. So we had over 27 hours of audio to transcribe and analyze. And from that, we produced 12 key themes. And perhaps unsurprisingly, they pretty much match the nature of connectedness and predispositions, which was kind of our interview guide, with a few other things in there as well. You know, social spaces kept coming up again and again. So even though that's not one of the aspects of social capital, it is certainly one of those areas that is important for the enabling context, as well as the activation context. So we included that as a key theme because it kept coming up again and again. So I won't go through these in too much detail right now because I'll actually talk about each one of these and share some quotes with you from participants as we go through. So from all of this, part one and part two, we got a pretty rich and detailed picture of what we think is going on in Guernsey in terms of the social capital. And I'll give you the 2-minute overview of those findings. So first of all, Guernsey has exceptionally strong social capital. You know, it's marked by strong social identity, high levels of connectedness, high levels of trust, social trust, importance of reputation. It's really an incredibly strong social capital. However, through the process, we are also identified numerous weaknesses and downsides, and also numerous threats to the strength of Guernsey's social capital. You know, things like rising inequality, increasing polarization, the influence of individualism, for example, were identified as threats through the methodology that we used. But it seems pretty clear that Guernsey's social capital, at least until now, has been relatively resilient to those mounting pressures and threats. You know, of course, from one study, we can't know for sure exactly how social capital has changed over time. But despite the existence of these threats for some time now, Guernsey is still displaying quite strong social capital, although there are clearly some weaknesses and some cracks appearing perhaps in the strength of Guernsey's social capital. And certainly there's widespread views that not enough is being done to address Guernsey's evolving challenges, and this seems to be one of the key threats to the strength of Guernsey's social capital, is a perception that not enough is actually being done. But whatever is being done, we need to balance the unique culture and the strengths of Guernsey's social capital against that need for change. You know, there's concern that if Guernsey were to change too quickly or in certain ways, Guernsey may lose its culture and those unique characteristics that make its social capital strong. But it's important to address those threats and the weaknesses of Guernsey's social capital, because a decline in social capital could have widespread negative impacts on Guernsey's economic and social well-being for decades. You know, we see that societal level social capital tends to change quite slowly, and a lot of the resilience in Guernsey's social capital seems to stem from events that happened as much as 70 or more years ago. And a lot of the participants very readily made reference to things like the German occupation during World War II as part of their identity, part of what made the collective solidarity and the strength of Guernsey's social capital. So despite the challenges, there is a lot of optimism as well. Guernsey, a lot of people believe that Guernsey has both the ability and the opportunity to avoid declining social capital. And that is something that came out quite strongly as a positive outlook towards what Guernsey people can actually do. So part 2, as I mentioned, was effectively a confirmatory survey. So we selected key statements from those 12 themes that we identified, and we asked a wider population the extent to which there was agreement with one strength and one weakness related to each of those themes. And we also asked in the survey for people's age, salary range, sector, employment sector that is, and whether or not they were an IOD, that's Institute of Directors member, so that we could do some basic demographic analysis as well on those results. So in total, we had 126 respondents to the survey, and overall a very high level of agreement, but of course there was a bit of diverse lived experiences and some different perspectives as well. So you can get an indication of just how much agreement there was. In the next slide, pink indicates strong agreement and blue indicates disagreement with those 24 in total statements that we asked participants. So as you can see, there's an enormous amount of pink here on this slide, the dark pink being strongly agree, as I mentioned, through to the dark blue being strongly disagree. So while there are a few that represent some diverse perspectives within the community, there is an enormous amount of agreement here between the interviewees and focus group participants in the first part and the second part, which was the survey. So by way of overview of the results of the survey, the average response was 4.1 out of 5, where 5 is strongly agree and 1 is strongly disagree. And we found that approximately half of the respondents were Institute of Director members. So we're a little concerned that maybe this wasn't representative of the wider community, because of course, IOD, not every resident of Guernsey is a member of the IOD. So we did a bit of analysis on that, and we actually found that non-members were slightly more likely to agree with the statements, with an average response of 4.18, with 5 being strongly agree, compared to only 3.95 for members. So this allayed any fears that our sample in the survey was not representative of the wider community. We actually found that the results from the first stage, the interviews and focus groups, were more representative of the wider community than just purely IOD members. And part of that variation came because non-members were more likely to agree with the strengths, non-members were similarly likely to agree with strengths and weaknesses, whereas IOD members were more likely to agree with strengths than the weaknesses, which I think is an interesting result. Overall, the people who were most likely to agree with strengths were over 65, those working in non-financial sectors, and those with a salary over £90,000. Whereas those most likely to agree with the weaknesses earned less than £20,000, or between £40,000 and £50,000. So I'm not sure what happened in between £20,000 and £40,000. There wasn't any statistically significant result there. So I'll run through each of those 12 key themes and share some quotes with you, and also the results of the survey, so we can see what the actual participants were saying. It gives us a really rich picture of the nature of social capital in Guernsey. So this is the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats related to the first theme. So the nature of social relationships and network configuration. So I'm not going to attempt to read all of these things, but I want to point out a few of the strengths. So first of all, it's very easy to meet people and to find commonalities. And it's actually normatively appropriate to explore and try and find those commonalities when you meet somebody you don't know. It's generally friendly, safe, trusting, and approachable to live in Guernsey. And overall, there's high levels of social interaction and few barriers to socialization. There's good work hours, short commutes, close distances. People feel like they're unlikely to be alone. If they go somewhere, they're going to meet people they know. There's comfort and familiarity with locations, and they're more likely to have repeat interactions with people that they meet. There are, though, weaknesses. We tend to find that the strengths and the weaknesses almost go hand in hand, and that's the nature of social capital. So despite high levels of connected, there's also some significant disconnects as well. So the biggest ones that people talked about was largely on socioeconomic basis, between the wealthy and the not so wealthy. But there's also between newcomers, perhaps between youth and older people, and also people with mental health challenges also were relatively isolated. People also talked about deep generational divides as well. So let's explore a few quotes from the participants, because this really brings it to life. So someone said, compared to living in London, living in Guernsey, I'd say there are 10 times more people in your immediate social network. And someone else said, if you don't know a third party that might be talking to an acquaintance or a friend about, then they'll quote another reference point and you'll find a reference and you'll find something in common. And people talked a lot about how easy it was to find things in common with people and therefore to form relationships with people that they didn't know. And also the amount of time that people have. Someone said if your commute is 5 minutes, not 2 hours, so in the evening you have 3 or 4 more than my London friends to socialize and to do things. So we asked, the statement that we selected then for the survey was to ask about whether it is common to try and find things in common, which is really the basis of forming the relationships. And as you can see, the dark pink is the strongly agree. So the vast majority of people agreed, but a small handful of people disagreed with it to some extent. Again, it's really important to acknowledge the different lived experience that some people have, and not everybody necessarily agrees with all of these statements. And that's one of the key things about evaluating social capital in this way, is that we need to appreciate that not everybody has the same access and the same opportunities to be able to build and use social capital within society. So that's a strength, but let's also look at some weaknesses as well. Because some people said that everyone's just very segregated. I think there's massive segregation across the island of, the people who are in the lower bracket and the places that they would frequent. The people are in the higher brackets, they're not rubbing shoulders with. They don't want to see that we have poverty in Guernsey because it's not very visible. And another participant said that definitely our poorer members of the community feel very forgotten. Well, they're not going to understand us, you don't know anything. So reflecting that idea that there are actually some pretty significant disconnects within society, even though on interpersonal level, lots of people feel like they know lots of other people. So we asked about that in the survey. Is it quite segregated? And there was a high level of agreement. Just about 3/4 of people agreed on some level. And overall, younger people were more likely to agree with this statement, with no disagreement at all from anyone younger than 35 years of age. And the average response for people under 35 was 4.3, indicating a high level of agreement, whereas for people older than 35, the average was only 3.6. So this seems to indicate that as people get older, they didn't feel like society was quite as segregated. Perhaps they were more established and entrenched within their networks, and they felt like they knew more people. So it's certainly an interesting finding that it wasn't reflected evenly between people of all ages. The next theme we identified was knowing about connections, because of course it's one thing to know somebody's name, but it's another thing altogether to know about them. Because when you know about them, it then opens up opportunities to be able to engage in social action. And if you don't know your friend is a mechanic or an accountant or something, or knows particular skills, then you're not going to identify opportunities to be able to engage in social action with them around those interests or those skills or abilities. So in terms of strengths, we found there was very high levels of social interaction and few barriers for socialization. And there's very strong norms of information sharing as well. Whereas on the weaknesses side, we felt that some people, particularly young people, can feel very claustrophobic about that high level of connectedness and ideas about limited privacy as well. So let's explore some of the quotes from participants about this. So on the strengths side first, one person said, when I was a kid, the key place for meeting people seemed to be, from observations as a kid on the high street, everyone needs to stop everyone else and just chat. Coming to town wasn't so much about shopping, but just ambling up the high street and having a natter with the first person you meet. And another person said, I think especially if you don't know someone, but oh, you must know someone. What sport team do you play? What office do you work in? What schools your kids go to? That kind of question that you'd ask. You'd try and find, like, that we're connected in some way. And again, it's about the high level of social interaction that occurs in Guernsey, but also that norm of wanting to find the commonalities with people, and as a result, getting to know people quite a bit better. So we asked about that in the survey, and we found, again, very high level of agreement, unsurprisingly. And there was no statistical difference between age or salary range or sector, which was interesting to find, that everybody seemed to think that there were very few barriers to socialization, and everyone tended to spend a lot of time interacting with each other. But then moving on to the weaknesses of knowing a lot about connections is that idea about claustrophobia. Now, someone said it can feel very claustrophobic for you in your 20s, I'm sure. I was very pleased to leave at 18, so I do sympathize with people from my generation that didn't go away. And someone else said, if in London, you're just one little face in a massive sea of faces. You have to be a bit more aware and a bit more guarded, I feel, here, because you have to worry a little bit more about how you might be perceived or how you might be spoken about. So this was a common theme coming out, and we asked about it in the survey. And again, we found also a pretty high level of agreement with it. In general, the older respondents were less likely to agree. In fact, none of the respondents over 65 agreed with this statement. They either were unsure or perhaps disagreed to some extent. But the highest level of agreement was from respondents aged between 25 and 34. And they had an average response of 4.55, which is very high level. Majority of them indicating strongly agree on that one. So again, indicating the difference in the lived experience across different age groups. The next theme that we looked at was the nature of social spaces, which I mentioned what came out very, very powerfully. On the strength side, there's lots of free outdoor spaces that can be used when the weather is good, diverse sporting facilities, and a general perception that for its size it has a wide range of facilities. Weaknesses, though, is that many of these cost money. There's a general shortage of physical community space, particularly accessible spaces, and particularly the free or low-cost spaces, particularly for youth. So let's check out a few quotes from participants about this. I said, opportunities and facilities, like we're spoilt rotten, If you went to a town in the UK with 64,000 or however many, there's no way you'd have our sporting facilities. Like, you can windsurf, you can sail, you can play hockey, play basketball before or after, and then go to volleyball, like, 2 or 3 times in one night. So the opportunities and facilities, our children in music are doing Shakespeare at the moment, and, like doing dance and doing. So I think we have, lots of opportunity, and I think we're encouraged to try a little bit of everything. So certainly for some people, they felt like there was a lot of social space and a lot of opportunities to engage in social action. This was reflected by, well, still strong agreement, but certainly not as strong as some of the other survey questions we asked. And particularly for those respondents who were most likely to disagree, had a salary of less than £30,000. So again, indicating that a lot of opportunities, these social spaces, cost money. And if you don't have a high income, then these spaces may not be available and accessible to you at all. The average response for people under 25 was only 3.1. So barely unsure, barely in the middle, compared to 4.4 for people over 65. So these numbers are really strongly supporting the findings from the first stage of the research that particularly social spaces for the poor and for youth are insufficient in Guernsey. So moving on then to the weaknesses. These comments came out pretty strongly in the qualitative portion of the research. It's virtually impossible, that is, socializing without spending lots of money. It is, very sort of money oriented, especially if you've got children I don't even know some people, if you weren't working in a high-paying job, I've got no idea how you can survive, bring up kids, and pay rent. Another person said, I think that there is like a lack of areas for young people to meet, particularly. This was actually a young person. That's what I found growing up, especially if you look outside, it's raining. Like, where really are there for you to go and hang out with your friends? What do you actually do apart from going to each other's houses? But it gets a bit boring. That's what I found. So we asked in the survey about the lack of free or low-cost spaces. And certainly there was a high level of agreement. And unsurprisingly, particularly from people aged between 25 and 34, the average response from them was 4.73, which is just about everybody strongly agreeing with it. Interestingly, there was no significant differences based on salary level, which seems to indicate a broad awareness that this is a weakness in Guernsey that's relevant across all income levels. So we'll just keep rolling through each of these themes and getting a nice detailed and rich picture of what's going on in Guernsey. So the next one is associational membership, participation, and engagement, because associations bring people together and connect them. They can be a really important source of connections for people. So in Guernsey, there's a very strong third sector. There's a strong history of sporting activities, and there's also a lot of overlap in associational participation, meaning that you see the same people in lots of different associational contexts, and you therefore makes it a lot easier to get to know people. But there are weaknesses. People talked about reducing volunteerism, and other pressures on associational activity, particularly some new legislation that came out that increased pressures on governance, also pressures on funding and corporate volunteering and so forth. So let's have a look at some quotes. Someone said, sports and some of these associations are quite strong. I think my experience from working elsewhere is the working day in Guernsey is a bit more likely to be 9 to 5:30 than in almost anywhere else I've worked. Everything's really close, so you can go and play football after work, or go to the beach after work, or go to a charity. All these kinds of things are a massive advantage. When I was working in London, everything was 40 minutes away. And the chance of meeting at 5:30 were approximately zero. So this indicates that accessibility and that willingness and interest in being able to engage in associations, which obviously increases both membership, participation, and engagement in them. So we asked then about whether or not Guernsey has a diverse range of groups and activities, and the response was overwhelmingly strong. Yes, only 3 people indicated that they somewhat disagreed, and nobody indicated that they strongly disagreed with this at all. Although there was a high level of agreement in general, older residents were more likely to strongly agree with this statement. So older people more likely to agree with this than younger people. There are, of course, weaknesses, as there are with each of these, and we pulled a lot of those out from this research. Someone said, I think one of the problems is that charities, as you know, are under-resourced, underfunded. They don't have somebody who perhaps has those skills at dealing with a corporate because they're too busy trying to do, the job that they were hired or volunteering to do, like, looking after children who have been abused or giving refuge to people who are trying to flee domestic violence. So you can't expect all of them to have all of the other skills as well, which was speaking about the pressures that these associations are increasingly under to be able to deal with corporates to get funding, to be able to deal with new legislative requirements in terms of governance, and various other challenges that many of the third sector organisations have. So we asked then whether Guernsey has declining volunteerism due to an ageing population, increasing cost of living pressures, and a lack of time, because what came out very strongly in the first sector. And while there was a high level of agreement, there was also quite a lot of people who were unsure about this. In fact, 22% of respondents were unsure, perhaps indicating a lack of awareness of the situation or having mixed views about this situation. And there were no significant differences based on demographic characteristics. So it's clearly an issue that some people are aware of and think is important, but perhaps not a high level of awareness or not everybody agreeing with it. So the next one was organizational capacity, because it's, well, one thing to have these kinds of associations and organizations, but if they're not very effective, if there isn't strong leadership and skills to be able to run them effectively, then they can't do very much. So this came out quite strongly as one of the themes as well. So one of the strengths is many highly skilled people, and also strong networks between organizations, whereas weaknesses was a perception of a shortage of skilled volunteers, which is really interesting because a strength came out was there are highly skilled people, but also a lack of skilled people as well. So I guess different perceptions that were coming out. There was some perceived problems with founder syndrome, a desire for power and prestige that drove people to create these organizations that weren't necessarily being particularly effective. And obviously lack of funding and various other kinds of capacity issues that came out. So quotes related to the strength. I think there's such a high caliber of, good people over there, good qualifying experienced people that actually, the charities do tend to identify it quite quickly where gaps lie. Funding is always difficult with charities and sporting associations, but actually it's, likely easier than in the UK, because of the networks that we have here. So again, identifying those networks between organizations and between these organizations and corporates that allow things to get done. But as you probably noticed several times, Guernsey compares itself to the UK. Like, it's kind of sort of part of the UK, but they're constantly talking about London and the UK as their point of comparison, rather than France or United States or Australia or any other country that they might make comparisons to. So we asked then in the survey about the highly skilled people, and there was a high level of agreement there. I certainly think there are a lot of very highly skilled people within the corporate sector, which then obviously contribute to the associations, clubs and charities and so forth. In terms of weaknesses, someone said we've created a charitable sector which is, a monster in itself. It is a measure of success that we have loads of charities on Guernsey. I mean, oh, we've got another charity. Great, another charity. So we have founder syndrome. People create charities, create a job, create roles for people, and then, oh, aren't we doing a great job? It's because personality clashes have happened, or we have a charity started up because someone has a particular passion about something. That's fine, but actually, is there a need? There are loads of charities doing the same thing, and could we rationalize them? So this seems to be a bit of a challenge in Guernsey. It was reported by quite a few people. So we asked about it in the survey. Many groups and organizations in Guernsey suffer from founder syndrome, where people seek and create roles for prestige and social status. So we did see some mixed results here in the survey. About half agreed, over a quarter were unsure, and there was some disagreement as well, perhaps from people who had founded charities for the kinds of reasons that were described by that participant and might want to disagree with this kind of a statement. But all the same, it certainly reflects that this may be an issue, but there is different perceptions of it as well. So the final aspect of connectedness that we looked at was the nature of roles, rules, and procedures, because again, roles, rules, and procedures connect people together and give people reasons to want to engage, make connections, and engage in social action. So on the whole, the strengths, people are motivated to participate in civil society and to take on roles. And many of the rules and procedures are aligned with the Guernsey way. The Guernsey way is difficult to define, but it's a way of doing things that reflects this kind of collective solidarity in Guernsey and the very strong cultural trait of wanting to help one another. On the weakness side, though, the people do tend to seek roles for social status and prestige, which was identified in the previous theme as well. There are some strong negative perceptions of politicians and the mechanisms of government. In fact, just about everybody had some pretty negative things to say about the system of government. There is a desire for prestige as well that can be a barrier for collaboration. So there's quite a few negatives or weaknesses coming out here as well. So let's have a look at a quote related to the strength. So you can go and talk and influence any members of government. We're a sovereign state. We can do our own legislation. We can make it slightly different to anywhere we want. We can have agency over our schools and our school system. We currently choose the UK system, but why would we choose that? We would not go for something that is considered better. So again, comparing to the UK was a pretty common theme. And that seems to be a strength, at least, that you can easily talk to members of government and you can have that connection with the rules, roles, and procedures. So we asked about the strong community spirit where people feel empowered to take on roles. It was a pretty high level of agreement there. Over 3/4 of people agreed, but you can see a lot of them were somewhat agreeing rather than strongly agreeing. And there were no statistically significant differences based on age or salary or sector. In terms of weaknesses, someone made this comment, which is quite powerful. Government incompetence is burning. Some individuals' willingness to step up and contribute to society is being eroded. I write with reference to my own feelings. I'm a 5th-generation local. Father lived here in the occupation, but law changes have hurt us financially, and poor culture with reference to productivity within the civil service versus business offends my sense of what's right and wrong for the island. I've worked in it and have a relative who still does. This is not purely anecdotal. And I find myself less and less determined to stay and contribute. This makes me sad, but I reluctantly admit that the deep delusionment is real. So this is reflective of some of those really strong negative perceptions of politicians and the mechanisms of government. And I was a little surprised by this, to be honest. Like, I heard just about every participant in the qualitative part talking about it, but we have, about 65% or so of people strongly agreeing and no one at all strongly disagreeing with it. Just a handful of people somewhat disagreeing. So this is a really major problem for Guernsey in terms of community solidarity, social identity, and many other aspects that are related to social capital. So the next one I'll look at is the first aspect of predispositions, which is reputation. So this is relational trust. This is at the individual level, including reputation for trustworthiness. So overall, as a strength, relational trust tends to be strong, and it's linked to the importance of reputation. But as a weakness, we also see there's risk aversion and fear of judgment, which is linked to that importance of reputation as well. Again, where we see a strength, quite often we see weaknesses as well that relate in some way, shape, or form. There's often a desire to conform to the group, including conform to opinions within the group, and some people tend to be careful or suspicious of unknown individuals or organizations. Again, it's often linked to a sense of the importance of reputation. So let's have a look at some of the strengths here. Yeah, you can trust people. Your reputation is everything. So I think the fact that we are a community where services are based on word of mouth, you just want to do your absolute best. And someone else said, we have these social feedback loops of accountability, that you have to walk in the same streets as the people you've done something to, and that has its own self-regulating dynamics. So we asked about the importance of reputation and whether or not people are more likely to act carefully and less likely to be antisocial towards others. And again, a very, very high level of agreement with this statement, just a handful of people really who are disagreeing with it. In general, younger people agreed with the statement a little more than people over the age of 55, which I thought was interesting because it reflects, I guess, the fact that your reputation stays with you for a long time, and maybe young people maybe care a little bit more about their reputation. In terms of weaknesses, it's a bigger environment like London. I think it's easier to sort of move on from that reputational damage without any collateral damage occurring in those bigger environments. Again, comparing Guernsey to London. When someone fails here publicly, there isn't a lot of people who come around them. If you're born here, you live with ever done for life. So some pretty strong comments there about the impacts and the implications of reputation. So we asked about collaboration because we were getting some interesting pictures about people saying that they were very reluctant to collaborate, very happy to cooperate because you didn't have to put any skin in the game, but a little reluctant perhaps to collaborate. So we asked about it and we got the most mixed response out of any of the questions that we asked. We found people with salaries between 50 and 90,000 were more likely to agree, 4.1 on average compared to 3.1 for lower and higher salaries. So there must be something about that kind of salary range that made people have this kind of experience relative to people with lower and higher salaries. But it certainly represents a very diverse lived experience in Guernsey in relation to collaboration. So the next theme was social trust. So there are widespread perceptions that Guernsey is safe and friendly, strong positive narratives that reinforce perceptions of trustworthiness and that Guernsey way that I talked about. But there are weaknesses as well. So despite being very trusting and safe, there are certain areas of distrust as well that came out quite strongly, and particularly distrust across the social divides and distrust of politicians and the political process as well, and a desire or a need, perceived need at least, to be careful and suspicious of unknown individuals. So let's have a look at some quotes. In terms of strengths, I always think that we're so lucky to live in this little bubble called Guernsey where it's safe. There's hardly any crime. There's no terrorism. I've never been burgled. You know, it's completely safe. Whereas in any of those other places and many more, you know, I'm definitely, you know, streetwise. I'm thinking constantly. And I was really surprised. This really struck me on day one of the research, in fact. People were making comments like this. You know, my car wouldn't be locked. My house is unlocked. My bike is unlocked. These are different people making these comments. I leave my keys in the ignition of the car. You know, someone talked about, oh, my wallet's probably sitting on the front seat right now and the window's down. You know, really high levels of social trust, at least in relation to these kinds of things. So we asked about that. You know, there are widespread perceptions that Guernsey is safe and friendly and that it's okay to leave everything unlocked. And just have a look at that. Hardly anyone disagreed. Very, very high levels. In fact, only 3 people disagreed, and only 1 person strongly disagreed, and over half of the respondents, 56%, strongly agreed. In general, younger respondents were more likely to strongly agree with this statement. So there's clearly some very strong narratives, particularly amongst young people. Maybe they haven't yet been burgled or something, had some negative experiences that may make them not quite so sure. But there are weaknesses as well. So that dynamic of be careful is really high here. I do think there's a lot of be careful who hears that going on. And there is no trust between government and the community and business and the community. I would say there's not a lot of trust there either in the eyes of the community. So we asked about that need to be guarded and careful and watch what you say. And again, very, very high level of agreement, just about nobody disagreeing. In general, younger people were more likely to strongly agree with this statement, which I found interesting. Young people may be a little more concerned about their reputation again, as we found in one of the previous questions as well. Young people seem to be more careful and concerned about their reputation, maybe because it's going to be with them for longer, or maybe they have a distorted perception of just how important it is. So the next one, there's only a couple to go now. Norms, obligations, and expectations. So on the strengths side, we found there's many positive social norms that are really deeply linked to Guernsey's culture and identity. You know, there's widespread norms relating to regard for others and accommodating other people's needs. And Guernsey, in their road network, they have a system called filter in turn, which is where when you come to an intersection that's marked as a filter in turn, you let somebody else go. Basically, if they're there already, you let them go. It's like a 4-way stop sign in the United States, except that it's informal and you effectively make eye contact with somebody else and you wave them through. But everyone's so giving and sharing and have so much regard for each other, you can actually get stuck there while everybody's trying to get everyone else to go because they're so accommodating of each other's needs. So there's some really strong norms, obligations, expectations there. But there are some weaknesses, particularly that claustrophobia, difficult to escape and turn off. The high connectedness can be a barrier to collaboration, and there can be things like groupthink. So we've seen some of these kinds of weaknesses come out in relation to some of the other themes we identified as well. So in terms of strengths, someone said, I mean, if your car broke down in the road, you would look around and people would leap out of their cars and help push you to the side. I mean, I think that that is something that in our community people would do, I think. I actually think sometimes you don't need to ask. People will just step forward. And certainly something that I observed, I went across the street and people would be stopping. Even if there's no crosswalk there, people are extremely accommodating of other people's needs. Someone else said you can always very quickly get an answer to anything by putting it out there in a network. You know, it's remarkable what is possible in the island. It's very good. So we asked about helpfulness, and no one at all disagreed. In fact, 69% of respondents strongly agreed with this statement. And in general, people between 35 and 64 were most likely to strongly agree. And there was no statistical significant differences based on salary or industry or anything else. So this is very obviously an extremely strong narrative and an extremely strong norm in Guernsey. But there are some negatives as well. Guernsey people love a good moan. I think that they can be quite catching as well. Even if you're not a Guernsey person, but you live here, when I say Guernsey people, I think it's quite a trait of Indigenous Guernsey people. But I think it's also quite catching. And someone else said it's almost like keeping up with the Joneses. Like if somebody says something, you have to agree with them. Some people may be too scared to say something or have an opinion because they don't want to be wrong. So we asked about that, the tendency to have a moan and complain about things. And we asked whether or not Guernsey can feel like a glass half empty place to live, where complaints and pessimism can quickly snowball within the community. And there was a pretty strong level of agreement with this. In general, young people were less likely to strongly agree. And people between 45 and 64 had the most mixed responses, with some people strongly agreeing, but also some people disagreeing as well. But certainly a high level of agreement with that kind of negatives and the tendency towards pessimism, particularly around local issues. So the next one was goodwill, solidarity, and empathy. So on the strength side, there's clearly a very strong sense of solidarity within the community and a willingness to come together for a common good, a very strong desire to represent the island in a positive way and do right by others. And a lot of people talked about how special it was to live in Guernsey, being part of something really special. But on the weaknesses side, there's some serious, significant disconnects there. And people who are outside of the Guernsey way, there can be backlash as well towards that. And I've got a quote that I'll share with you about that. So on the strength side, someone said, I think in a world that has become increasingly individualistic, there is a sort of Western sense of collectivism here that doesn't exist that much in other cultures. This is more of a collectivist culture in a capitalist context of unbelievable levels of individualism. And somebody else said, I don't think talking about self-interested behavior, would work here. No, like there's a pay it forward culture here. And someone else said, I think the majority feel that they are part of something. They want to make sure that it's being kept the same way. So we asked about that strong sense of community spirit. Very high level of agreement, but really quite a lot of people only somewhat agreeing with it, which seems to be, and talking with people, it seems to be one of the things that's eroding from the current threats, the perception of not enough change, the increasing inequality and so forth, that there isn't quite the same kind of sense of community spirit, perhaps, as there used to be. That's reflected in some of those narratives that people talked about. On the weaknesses side, there's sometimes good in this island of saying something like the Guernsey Together slogan, which was a slogan that came out during COVID, Guernsey Together, to try and encourage people to come together to respond collectively. but the action, it's just not behind it. So it's the worst form of we're all in this together, as long as I'm just going to be a little bit ahead of you kind of perception. And certainly there was a lot of talk about not adapting quickly enough to the evolving challenges that Guernsey faces, and there was an incredibly high level of strongly agree with this statement, with the highest level coming from younger people. Social identity and belonging. So there's a really strong sense of identity that's positive, based on pride and respect and solidarity, and a very strong connection to place. On the weaknesses side, there's some attachments to historical identity of Guernsey that may present barriers to change as well, and aspects of stubbornness and pride and so forth that can be negative. So this is quite a long quote. But it sums it up really nicely. That Guernsey identity is about connectedness, trust, safety, and belonging. It certainly is the fact that you may not know someone, but you recognize faces, much like the landscape. I mean, I feel very, very connected to the landscape and the familiarity of the spring flowers and the seasons. It's a place of enormous natural beauty, and that is very precious to me. So I feel very protective of our coastline and our landscape and it's certain rocks and formations, you know, the visual of the P stacks or the symbol of Fort Grey. There are places in Guernsey, you know, just the way that the slipways are built and the way that they absorb the heat throughout the day, and you can lean up against them at the end of the day. The boat ride to Herm, there are, I think, because we're such a small place, there are lots and lots of common experiences. So quite poetically describing the connection to place and people and the symbols and the shared experiences that exist in Guernsey. So people talked about it being, identity being somewhat intangible, but really strongly connected to community. And there was a pretty high level of agreement with this. But again, a lot of people only somewhat agreeing, so perhaps not quite being sure. And I think that's that intangible nature. A lot of people kind of reflected that they weren't really quite sure what Guernsey's identity was. But when they thought about it, they came up with the kinds of things that I just mentioned. There are downsides, though. So we do have this hugely, you know, loving, supportive island, that which is probably your general populace, but then it's really bashed about by this huge wealth and disparity between the two sides. It's a friendly place where people do care for each other and look out for each other, but I think the culture clash of the wealth that then stops that from actually able to happen for everybody is a shame. So there's also clearly coming under threat from issues like inequality. So we asked about that in the survey. That strong sense of independence and stubbornness might foster a resistance to change, and very, very high level of agreement with that. Stubbornness is a very important part of Guernsey identity. This really is the last one now, and then we'll get on to having some questions and discussion. So many of the shared narratives are positive and reinforce positive aspects of social capital. But on the downside, there are shared narratives that may not be true, or at least not true anymore, and also that tendency to reinforce conservatism and lack of change as well can be pretty powerful. So these are some of the kinds of narratives that I heard over and over and over again. You know, people talked about being stubborn and proud and resilient, about punching above our weight, as in being more successful considering they're only a small population. Conservative with a small c. Being quiet and understated, particularly relative to their neighbour, Jersey, which is one of the other Channel Islands. A narrative where you know everybody and you never feel alone. Of course, you can't know 64,000 people, but that's a strong part of the narrative, that you know everyone. Someone helps, especially crossing the road, it's safe. You know, there's a lot of narratives here that are really quite positive. So we asked about that. You know, the social fabric woven with these strong positive narratives. And there was a pretty high level of agreement, but again, a lot of people only somewhat agreeing with it. The weaknesses then, so the negative narratives, basically, politicians are not trustworthy. It's probably not unique to Guernsey. Aurigny, that's the national airline, loses money, which apparently is not actually true, but it's a very common narrative. Things like the education system is terrible, that change isn't happening enough or fast enough, that old people are out of touch. There's a lot of negative narratives here, mostly relating to traffic and the education system and the health system and all these kinds of local issues. But particularly, we found that there seems to be a lack of appropriate forums in Guernsey, that tendency for people to have a good moan and complain. So we asked about that, and there was a high level of agreement. Nobody disagreed with it whatsoever. So we were able to then, through this process, be able to tabulate the various threats to the various aspects of social capital in Guernsey. And I won't go through this in detail, but through the process, in all of those tables we saw different threats. We're able to then map them against each of these aspects of social capital. I'll share these slides with everybody afterwards if you want to check this out in more detail. And this is in the report as well, if you want to have a look at it. And this was really illuminating of seeing where the biggest threats to social capital lie. And I think this will then allow for Guernsey to look at these threats and to see which ones of them they want to address most urgently. So generally speaking, how can social capital be improved? Well, it can be improved when more people are connected, when people feel more connected, when people are more predisposed to act in positive ways, and when people have more reasons to be positively social towards others, whether that be because of trust or belonging or norms or any of those other aspects of social capital. And of course, when there are fewer barriers and less risk and uncertainty related to acting positively towards others. So what then can be done in Guernsey? What has this research identified? Well, for a start, there's a great opportunity to enhance and safeguard its social capital, because through this process of this project, there's now a really rich picture of what's going on in Guernsey, and individuals and social groups, charities, organisations, and also the states of Guernsey can choose what kind of actions they want to take, given that they now have this rich picture. And overall, there's that optimism that I talked about, the island's independence, self-governance, culture of reinvention, which provides a solid foundation for safeguarding their social capital. And the report contains many, many, many possible actions that they might like to look into. So these are the ones related to connectedness, relating to the nature of social relationships and so forth, and they're listed here. I won't go into these again in detail. They're in the report if anyone wants to dig into them. And these are ideas, of course, reflecting the unique culture of Guernsey, nature of its own governance. It's up to Guernsey to choose which ones are going to be most relevant and appropriate for their context. So again, these are the ones related to predispositions. And what we did after this research is I went back to Guernsey and I presented the results at the IOD annual convention last month. And that really was the start of these kinds of conversations where Guernsey people can start to determine for themselves what kinds of actions they want to take now that they have this richer understanding of what's going on. So that's it from me. Covered an enormous amount of content there. So I'd like to invite questions. If anybody has any or any comments you would like to make, feel free to raise your hand if you would like, or you can also post in the chat. I'd be happy to read out the question and respond to it. So Andy, your hand is up. Feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to make a comment or a question.
Firstly, many congratulations on a really substantive piece of work. I think that what you've perhaps produced here is something that we might. I come from a PR background, so it might be the Guernsey model, but I think you've provided a very, very valuable tool for getting social capital further up the agenda. And I think, as I say, I think I'd really urge it. I mean, obviously you're doing now with this seminar and so on, but I'd really urge you to sort of consider branding it, sorry, my marketing man here, as the Guernsey model. And that I think you've got a very, very powerful process asset for sharing with the world there, and many valuable insights. Really, one sort of big question really is that one of the challenges anyone involved in social capital is getting it on the agenda. And it seems to me that you benefited from a situation where it was put on the agenda, but then you critically help them advance it and get it firmly established. Because I think this sort of thing should be a norm for every community. What were the factors that led Guernsey to get it on identify and recognise social capital and get it on the agenda? What were the factors there that, provided you then with the launch pad to do what you did?
Thanks, Andy. Great question. I have to give full credit to the Institute of Directors in Guernsey for putting it on the agenda in Guernsey. They identified it as a theme that they wanted to present at their annual convention. They then engaged in and funded the research to then inform that presentation. So they weren't just simply going through an academic exercise of talking about social capital in a theoretical sense. They wanted to have the real life experience of Guernsey to be able to present to the audience in Guernsey. So the Institute of Directors was the driving force of that action. And there was an enormous amount of interest in it. And I can't speak to exactly what their motivations were. But what they did say was they talked about those threats and challenges that they were perceiving in Guernsey, and this sense that social capital was effectively the way forward, that Guernsey had strong social capital, but that it was under threat, and they wanted to, one, safeguard it and enhance it, but also they saw that the opportunity there that by having strong social capital, they would be able to leverage that to actually fix many of their problems, address the collective action issues that they have and that they feel are really important. Because when you think about what social capital is good for, number one really is resolving collective action problems. So I think hinting perhaps at what you're asking about as well is, would this be useful for other localities? And I think, yes, absolutely. I mean, you and I both are going to be saying that because we both work with social capital and we think it's a very useful concept. But I think that there's an enormous amount of understanding came out of this research project, this methodology for evaluating social capital in a location that informs so many different potential actions across so many different areas of society. I was being contacted by charitable organizations who wanted to understand their social capital within their organization, but also within the Guernsey society to be able to do better, as in to improve their practices and the performance of their organization. So it has applications for every individual, for every organization across every sector, and for society more broadly as well. And it has you can then see where the benefits can come. Guernsey has some challenges around its education system, but by mobilizing its social capital and engaging in the kinds of discourse that it has the potential to do because of its strong social capital, it will be able to resolve many of those kinds of problems. So we very deliberately are hands off on what Guernsey does next. One of the things, I mean, you would anyway, but one of the cultural traits in Guernsey is absolutely don't want to be told by an outsider what to do. And that came out quite strongly in the research. And so self-determination is incredibly important. I mean, it always is, but it's especially important in Guernsey. So I'm not going to tell them what to do. There's lots of ideas there, and the research has illuminated a complex but rich picture of what could be done. So any other questions?
Tristan.
Yep.
Yes. Is that Raymond, is it?
Raymond. Yeah, it's Raymond.
Okay, go ahead, Raymond.
Yeah, you're talking about the social capital evaluating and how it relates to social well-being and economic and social well-being, right? I was just curious when I was listening. How do you think this social capital will correlate with economic numbers? I mean, just trying to imagine, because you're saying social capital contributes to economic development, right? So I was thinking, I was to do additional research on this, how would I correlate with these two variables? Because you're saying I guess you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, I do. Thanks for the question, Raymond. I think that the way to do it is to look at the actions of individuals that contribute towards the economic development in the way that you're talking about, and then to work backwards to evaluate the nature of social capital that contributes towards those outcomes specifically. So many of the participants, without being prompted, were talking about how the strong level of interconnectedness meant that employees could very easily reach out to their network to solve problems within their organization, their work problems, or to improve their work performance with individuals both within and outside of their organization. So that improves economic development, improves the effectiveness, efficiency, productivity of the organization. And so you could, if you wanted to, you could then effectively evaluate that more specifically. So clearly this research project was looking very broadly at society. You know, I've talked before in other webinars about how you can build social capital in a general sense, which is just generically connectedness, trust, well-being, collective solidarity, social identity, and so forth. Or you can build social capital towards a specific kind of outcome, which would be looking at the nature of say, social norms that facilitate the specific actions of individuals that contribute towards the specific outcome that you're interested in. So what I'm saying is this research project was general across all of society, but you could tailor the research to look at a specific outcome. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yeah, excellent. Thank you very much.
Question here, Tristan.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Well, first I want to add to what Andy said. A really superb piece of research, and I love the way you integrated and the personal comments in the forums, and then going on to set up survey questions, and the way it maps onto your scheme. I think that was all beautifully done. Major things that come out, one can understand from what we know about small communities, but the question I have, because I'm puzzled about, interested in how one might explain it, what might be seen as a contrast between what you characterize as people like to having a moan, so there's the moan thing, and something you said at the very end in particular, and I hope I've got this right, that there was a feeling of positivity about going for opportunities and doing better. They're not entirely opposites, but they sit together rather unhappily. So I found that really interesting. Can't quite understand it. Wonder how general it might be of societies, and like to have your thoughts about it.
Yeah, no, great question, because it does seem like it's contradictory. And what we found is that internally within Guernsey, people love to complain and moan about everything. But externally, they love to talk about how wonderful and special Guernsey is at the same time. And so it seems to be linked, at least in part, to the nature of the finance sector in Guernsey is that they need to portray image of being trustworthy and reliable, and everything's good and everyone's above board and everyone's doing the right thing, so they can attract high net worth individuals, so they can attract companies that want to use Guernsey for financial services. So everyone in Guernsey is acutely aware of that need to portray Guernsey positively to the outside, and the general collective solidarity that means that most people will get on board with that aim of portraying Guernsey positively. And they're fiercely proud as well, don't forget. But internally, they will moan about the hedges not being cut on some road, or the traffic, or the roadworks, or the something or other. So you get this really interesting dynamic of glass half empty and complaining in certain circumstances, but wildly optimistic and positive and proud in other circumstances.
Right. Very interesting. Thank you.
Anna, feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment.
Hi, hello. Sorry, I don't have a camera today, but I'm speaking from Oxford. And thank you for the presentation, Tristan. It's the first time I see you live, but I've been following you since my PhD. And I'm just curious, like from my expertise, I often look at social capital from a networks perspective, or taking a stronger stance in looking at networks. And here I'm super curious, maybe you disagree, but I'm super interested if you disagree, is given that this is a small place relatively, and that there's probably people that have strong influence on what things may happen or may not, have you looked at, or was there any interest in understanding who has stronger opinions about what and how they could influence? Because from, as you know, social capital perspective, who has power in certain structural networks can really influence the capacity for collective action in this context. So I would love to hear if you had intuitions, but they weren't interested on that, or they were interested, or you didn't want to take a stance in, looking at social networks more specifically. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Thanks. A great question as well. I think we were constrained, of course, as every research project is, by the funding and resources to conduct it. So I think there would be a lot of use in doing some form of network analysis and identifying the structure of the networks and who is influential with those networks, where the structural holes are, and so forth. I think that would be quite useful. And almost on a population of 64,000, I wonder whether or not you could almost try and do everybody just about, or find some ways to be able to find data that would support that kind of level of analysis. So the decision not to do it is because ultimately the Institute of Directors and I felt that it was produced more interesting results doing it the way we did it overall. So a more detailed picture of the nature of predispositions, basically the nature of trust, social identity, the narratives, the shared understandings, and so forth, which wouldn't have been illuminated had we looked at network configuration and structure. So I think to answer your question, would a network analysis be useful in Guernsey? Yes, absolutely. It almost is one of the unanswered pieces of the puzzle right now. It's an area that wasn't particularly well illuminated at all by this research. And so I think it would be useful if there was funding and resources to do it. I think it would be quite a useful exercise in Guernsey.
Thank you.
Then just some technical questions.
Yes.
Did you use any software to do your semantic analysis, like in vivo or MathQDA?
No. I did it manually.
Wow. It's taken a long time. How long does this research take?
3 months. So we did the interviews and focus groups in late June. The survey was ready to roll out by early September, or in fact late August, and the survey ended in sort of mid-September, and then we had the final report published on the 4th of October.
Wow. So you had a team working with you?
No, just me.
Wow. Fantastic. Did you do any what do you call this, factor analysis? What do you call that, to get the Cronbach's alpha, to look at the
No.
reliability? No. Wow.
No. So
okay.
So again, it came down to a matter of funding and resources for this research, and we decided to simply do some very basic statistical analysis based on that demographic data. Also, the nature of using the quantitative as more confirmatory meant that it wasn't actually relevant to do much of that statistical analysis. And our sample size wasn't particularly big. 126 participants also limited us in our ability to do more complex statistical analysis.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Good questions there, Raymond. Anybody else have any questions or comments? We have at the most another 10 minutes, so there is time if you have any burning questions or comments to make.
Yeah, could you say,
John?
Is there more detail to be said about inequality?
Yes, there's a lot more to say about it, about inequality.
Well, yeah, just a rather general question, something I'm interested in.
So maybe there's a lot in the report, so I'll touch on it briefly. The desire to portray Guernsey positively meant that poverty is largely hidden in Guernsey. So a lot of people who contributed to the qualitative part said, look, I'm aware that inequality exists, but I don't actually know who's poor. I can't see it. And you know, there's food banks and there's charities. There's a lot of charities, really strong third sector. So people kind of do know that inequality exists, but they're not really quite sure who it is. People talked a lot about in-work poverty. People talked about how because it's hidden, people who are living in poverty don't get their views particularly well listened to because they, for whatever reason, some of it's about reputation, some of it's about image, some of it's just people don't want to hear it. And so there's a lot of social disconnects there that exist. That's one of the things a lot of people are really fed up with about the politicians and the system of government is that they don't seem to be listening to and addressing the issue of inequality sufficiently. So there's quite a complex picture there of reputation and just the demographics of the country, the way in which a lot of the social housing is intermixed in the different parishes. So you get people who are living in poverty attending really good schools. But then again, the public school system was also a lot of criticism of that. So a lot of people are then going to private schools, of course, and if you're living in poverty, you're not accessing the private schools. So I'm not sure how much I've answered your question, except there's a lot of data came out from the research that paints a pretty complex picture of the nature of inequality.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you.
I think we've got Andy next, and then we'll go to Yvonne. So Andy.
Yeah, would you go back to the slide where you had about predispositions? Because I just want to sort of maybe make a point. And that you've labeled them predispositions, but I do a lot of work on storytelling and narratives. And what I would suggest is that what you've identified is not necessarily so much predispositions, but underlying beliefs. And then those underlying beliefs then inform a narrative. But what you've identified as predispositions, I would suggest, are not narratives. They're underlying beliefs that then shape and inform the worldview. And it might sound pedantic, but then I think if you then look then by establishing those as beliefs, you can then get greater clarity about what is the shared narrative, what is the shared story that people have together. So just a sort of constructive suggestion there that rather than labeling predispositions, they're beliefs, and that you then maybe need to further refine what you're labeling narratives as, like the shared stories that are a consequence of those beliefs.
I suspect that you and I agree on everything, Andy, and it's probably just a matter of terminology. So the reason I use the term predispositions is because it encapsulates, it's the superordinate, it encapsulates beliefs, values, attitudes, understandings, emotions, states of being and understanding the world around us in a way that then shapes the nature of our actions. So what all of those things, beliefs, values, attitudes, emotions, understanding, and so forth, they all represent how we're predisposed to act in the world. And so I completely agree and take your point that beliefs are a central part of that, because they are our beliefs and our understandings and emotions. They are the foundation of what influences the nature of our actions in the world.
Okay.
Yvonne, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I think my video is not working correctly. So One thing that we're doing here, I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in the U.S., is that we're looking at enhancing social capital within different groups as well as across the community, where we have various cultural groups, we have different age groups, we have, looking at men, women. So we have what we call these community health action teams. That is the community wanting to outreach and with a goal of reducing social isolation and getting people socially connected. I was wondering, did you find pockets of individuals that were more socially isolated or who felt that they weren't connected? Um, uh, uh, and if there was some, related to culture or youth, what was your findings as far as were there some individuals that really felt that they weren't socially connected?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Yvonne. Yeah, definitely. There were quite a few different groups who felt quite socially isolated and disconnected from the rest of society. And there's various reasons for that. A lot of people talked about the lack of affordable social spaces, which created isolation for particularly the youth and the poor. People talked about the really strong nature of existing social networks that could be a barrier for some newcomers, and people use the term foreign workers. Not sure exactly what that means in a Guernsey context, but certainly people coming in from outside who would find it difficult to break into those established networks, depending on, of course, personality and if they're working in the finance sector, they seem to find it easier to break into those established networks. But there was still, for various reasons, particularly youth, particularly the poor, and particularly newcomers who were described as being far more isolated.
Thank you.
I think that's one of the benefits of using this kind of methodology, is that because you're asking questions about the nature of connectedness and the nature of roles and associational membership, and you're asking about norms and trust and all of these different aspects of social capital, that it illuminates. People are very happy to then talk about those kinds of issues and the ways in which people are connected or in fact isolated, and the reasons for it as well. And so you do develop this incredibly rich picture, which is why the report ended up being 224 pages or something long, is because you get this incredibly rich picture of what's going on within the community. So any other questions, anything else you've thought of, or comments you'd like to make?
I just wanted to know, how will you use this data? Is it going to be used to try to enhance some aspect, or how will you take this data and use it in the future?
Well, first and foremost, it's up to Guernsey how they're going to use it. So I presented the results at the convention, and obviously the report is available freely online for everybody to make use of it. Also, while I was in Guernsey, I had meetings with the states, which is the elected representatives in Guernsey, and the leaders of many of the large coordinating institutions as well, the head of the civil service and so forth. And so they now are empowered with this information to be able to make choices for themselves about how they use it and what they do next. And so I can tell you that they're very interested in creating constructive forums, forums where people aren't just simply complaining and moaning about things, but actually talking about issues that can help. One of the things I didn't say in the presentation was that Guernsey is a democracy, a consensus democracy. So it's incredibly necessary and important for people to actually come together and to find a level of shared understanding on issues. And so that there's a desperate need for that kind of a forum in Guernsey is what they identified, the research identified, and they've picked that up as one of the key things that they want to take forward. So I think that there's what Guernsey does is up to them, self-determination. But then, of course, this research provides a model for how other localities might be able to evaluate their own social capital in a similar kind of way, which then, of course, will improve the understanding of what's going on in those places as well.
Wonderful.
We have a minute or two left. So any final questions or comments? Well, let's wrap it up there. Thanks very much, everyone, for taking part. We have a fantastic series of webinars coming up in the next weeks. I'm just going to the events page on the website right now so I can actually have a look at what's coming up. Doesn't come to mind immediately, but you can check it out on the International Social Capital Association website. It's just loading now. So next week we have a webinar by Lauren Bigger, who's looking at the relationship between social capital and health outcomes. The following week we have a webinar on building social capital, a system engineering approach. And then the following week, we have a webinar on the relationship between social capital and urban design. So a great series of webinars coming up. They're always free. Everyone's welcome to attend. So I hope you can make it to some of those future events. And someone asked, Andy asked if I'm sharing the slides. Yes, I will send them out in the follow-up email, which will go out after the second session in about 12 hours or so from now. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. Great that you could attend. Look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Take
Thank
care.
you, Tristan. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you from Australia.
Mhm.